We all know the Schlieffen plan, Germany's famed strategy to win World War I over the span of a couple of months. Punch through neutral Belgium in an attempt to circumvent the border, where the French forces were expected to amass. From there, push fast towards the capital, its fall representing a massive symbolic and logistical blow to the French, after which the army can continue towards the Swiss border, in the process planning to encircle the entire French army in Lorraine and deal a truly debilitating strike to any French ability to resist. All of this was to occur on a very strict timeline, as whilst this was happening, Russia would undoubtedly be making progress in the east. Still, if all goes well, this plan allows Germany to negotiate a French surrender and refocus on Russia. Had the plan been successful, it is quite possible German hegemony over Europe would have been assured. But with hindsight, we know it didn't work. And we can produce a long list of reasons why it didn't. Things like Belgian resistance being stronger than expected, the Russians mobilizing faster than expected, the British Expeditionary Force coming to France sooner than expected, and many more. Yet, even beyond these factors, the plan fundamentally was very optimistic, working on razor-thin margins, the logistical and military feats necessary to bring it to conclusion being very steep. Thus, as the plan failed and the Germans got stuck in trenches in the west, the focus of the war shifted east, where the Russians would eventually be pushed back significantly. From this position, the broad front lines would essentially freeze for years, until Russia would fall to revolution and one last, desperate, failed attempt was launched to break France in the west. The Central Powers collapsed not too long after. So with all of this hindsight, I often see alternate histories debate how Germany could have won World War I. And a plan that comes back consistently is what if Germany didn't attempt the Schlieffen plan, instead choosing to fortify and defend the short border with France, putting all of their effort instead into first defeating Russia. On paper, this approach has quite a few benefits. The Franco-German border of 1914 is rather short, and should be holdable with less effort than the front line which the Germans created historically. The Russian army also simply wasn't up to the German level, and Germany could expect greater victories against them. Another major point often cited is that through this plan, Germany never invades neutral Belgium, which, it is hoped, could lead to British neutrality. Now, spoiler alert, it is still very likely that Britain joins against the Germans, even with such an alternate plan. But even beyond that, let's discuss the immense, fundamental flaws with the implementation of such a plan, from the perspective of the German elites at the time, before we even get to testing it with modern hindsight of the war. First, we need to reckon with the very mindset of the German military, which goes completely against everything this plan proposes. Due to Germany's geographic and diplomatic position, as well as their recent military history, German planning was obsessed with fast, short wars of annihilation. The same types of wars which led to German unification after defeating Austria and then later France. You win a few battles, incapacitating the opponent's ability to wage war, you threaten their capital, and then you win. A type of war which perfectly suited the Schlieffen plan. But Russia was a totally different beast, and everybody knew that you couldn't expect to just march to Moscow or St. Petersburg in a few months and bring the Russian behemoth down. Thus, for the German military leadership to commit to this plan, they need to commit to the concept of a long, drawn-out war. It should be clear why such a thing was unthinkable for Germany in the 1900s. From a strategic perspective, it was pure madness. Simply put, Germany just had very low odds of ever winning one. Germany did not yet compare to the economic might of the full British Empire, especially once joined by France. The Entente dominated global shipping lanes, commerce and finance. They had the population and diplomatic advantage, and while industrially the sites were relatively close, a lack of access to global resources would still hinder Germany a lot in this regard. Meanwhile, as Germany is fighting Russia, France and Britain are completely free to expand their own defenses in the West and using their own leftover troops in reinforcing and opening up new fronts elsewhere. At this point, you think, but what if Britain does remain neutral? To that I say, again, I doubt they will be, but we shall discuss that later. Far more importantly though, imagine you yourself are a German military planner. Can you really take that risk? Can you create an entire war strategy based on this hope that Britain won't join in? No, you cannot. Or at least, it would be extremely irresponsible. The plan must presume that Britain does join the conflict against you, and then you can be pleasantly surprised if it turns out that they do not. This is yet another element wherein the Schlieffen plan is just more appealing to the German high command. As if France is indeed successfully knocked out, this also renders the British army far less dangerous. We must also account for what the French and British might do while we are on our adventure in Russia. In hindsight, we know the French plan amounted to little more than attack and hope that it works out, and it was unlikely to successfully break through fully. But again, as a military planner, you must contend with the fact that about 3 million French soldiers are on your western flank, which if they do cross the border, swiftly come to threaten some of the most crucial industrial and resource regions of Germany. Even something like a French invasion of the Rhineland through Belgium needs to be seriously considered when making this war plan. A smaller, but still interesting point to consider is that France was still the bigger industrial power compared to Russia in 1914. Yet the invasion of northern France knocked out about a quarter of their industry and cut off about 75% of their iron and steel production, crippling blows to French industrial potential both before and after the war. Through Germany's focus on Russia, the French industry can work at full capacity throughout the war, further extending the industrial gap between the two camps, while the core of what industrial potential Russia does have is located so far east, Germany will struggle to knock it out in any swift time frame. But then, perhaps the biggest issue with this alternate battle plan. The Kaiser asks you, what about after Russia collapses and Eastern Europe is secure? How are we now going to force the Western Entente to surrender, after giving them years to shore up their defenses? Any form of attempted Schlieffen plan by this point is pure fantasy. So the only real way for Germany to secure their gains is simply hope that the West is demoralized, perhaps the people go on strike, and their governments just accept the status quo, giving up Eastern Europe to the Germans. Again, considering there is no way for Germany to actually force this concession from the West, this seems like a dangerous amount of wishful thinking I wouldn't want to wage the future of my global empire on. So, it should be clear, I don't regard this war plan very highly. In fact, I pretty categorically reject it. Committing to it goes against everything the German high command believed in. But even without that, this war plan is riddled with so many risks, and no clear way to secure their overall victory in the West. France and Britain are free to undertake military adventures across Europe with a fully functioning industry, and even with a full focus on Russia, the war in the East could still take years. Yet, there is one thing I have so far ignored, which might save this battle plan. But even then, it is a very slim chance. There are, however, diplomatic and military advantages of this plan after Franz Ferdinand gets shot. Yes, both France and Britain were aligned to Russia, France more so than Britain. Yet they would still have the task of convincing their population of the necessity of war. Historically, this was rather easy for France to do. Germany had declared war on Russia, and Germany had then declared war on France and invaded neutral Belgium and France itself. Convincing the people of the legitimacy of this struggle was very simple when it was no longer a war over Serbia, but a war for national defense. Yet in an alternate timeline, where Germany is more focused on Russia at the start, this leaves it up to the French politicians to convince the nation to go to war. To be clear, I very much expect that they managed to do this. As fears were mounting regarding Austrian action against Serbia, the French president visited St. Petersburg and confirmed that for the French government, the defense of Serbia was covered under their term of alliance with Russia. Besides, leaving Russia out to dry against the Germans risked leaving France very isolated once again. Yet, the possibility exists, especially if this alternate battle plan also changes the way Germany handles their pre-war diplomacy. There could be timelines where France doesn't get directly involved in a German-Russian war, as France and Britain instead start trying to find a diplomatic solution to the crisis. For today, we will only focus on the military aspects of this battle plan, and thus assume France does join the war. Yet I do find the concept of this alternate July crisis interesting. So no promises as to a release date, but I will be researching alternate conclusions to the July crisis, potentially for a sequel to this one in the near future. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. So, the scenario we are following today has Germany declare war on Russia, followed not too long after by a French declaration against Germany. French war enthusiasm at the start is lower, with especially the nation's socialists being more obstructionist regarding this war. Yet these negative effects on France are easily compensated with the advantage of not having most of your industry occupied, and in general, the war being less dramatic on the Western Front. Germany then launches an invasion of the Russian Empire, and already in our timeline, with a fraction of the troops, the Russians got humiliated in the early stages of the war. Now add approximately 2 million extra Germans to this initial invasion, and we have the recipe for a large-scale defeat of the Russian army. The good news though is that the logistics of the time were not conducive to all too massive blitzkrieg offensives, so we shouldn't expect the front lines to completely collapse. But for this initial stage of combat, the Russians are going to have to trade a lot of men and territory while trying to find a more defendable position, as the retreating Russian army slowly expands with new mobilized troops. Where exactly the front line stalls in this first bout of combat is difficult to predict, yet at some point the logistical lines grow and winter starts setting in, and the Germans will have to wait until the next spring to continue. Now a relatively important change to note here is that in our timeline, the Russians overran Austrian Galicia at the start of the war, thereby destroying about 50% of the Austro-Hungarian army and devastating their officer corps. These losses immediately doomed the Serbian campaign, as forces were now needed to be redirected north. Even in the long term, the Austro-Hungarians never fully recovered from this defeat. In this timeline, with Germany's immediate, strong pressure, this Galician debacle is either avoided or significantly less devastating, thereby affording Austria a more important role on the Eastern Front and potentially allowing them more successes against Serbia. But as this is happening, do the French actually manage to make progress in the West? Well, it is rather unlikely. Even in our timeline, France started the war with broad-scale attacks on Alsace-Lorraine, only to be repelled by the Germans. Considering the new German defensive mantra, their defenses and fortifications in the West would only be stronger. Many French soldiers would lose their lives in these early attempts, only to be largely rebuffed. So overall, this paints a rather bleak picture for the early Entente. The Russians partially demoralized from their early defeats, the Serbians under a worse initial threat, and the French, who were already less enthusiastic about the war, are frustrated by their inability to perform against a far smaller German defensive force. Things, absolutely look bad. But then again, do they necessarily look that much worse than in our timeline? As winter approaches and both sides entrench, the focus of the war shifts towards convincing the most important neutral nations towards your side. And of course, the most important of these nations is Britain. I want to be swift in noting that the idea that Britain only joined the war because of Belgium is a myth. Yes, it is true that this invasion justified their early entrance into the war, but even without it, Britain was clearly leaning towards the Entente. Germany categorically was a threat to Britain. They had become the first European state to eclipse them economically and industrially, and even in peacetime, this showed no signs of slowing down. Beyond that, Wilhelm II was remarkably bad at navigating European diplomacy, while openly musing about his global ambitions, in the process starting a naval build-up which Britain felt it had to counter. For these reasons and more, Britain, prior to the war, had agreed to align itself to France and Russia, and it should be obvious why it would be a disaster for them if Germany successfully defeated their only continental rivals and solidified control over most of the industrial resources and agricultural land of the continent. That said, the bulk of the Liberal Party who were in power in 1914 were pacifistic and maintained that Britain had no official obligation to help France directly, and they were not enthusiastic about rushing into war. Yet, it is important to note that the Liberals only had very weak control over Parliament, and there was an election to be had in 1915. Two by-elections in 1914 had showed that the Liberals were very likely to lose in a landslide, by which point the Conservatives, who were very clear about their intention to join the war, would likely get into power. Even before this election though, several high-ranking Liberals threatened resignation if the government didn't support France, and considering the thin margins in Parliament, if the Liberal government truly stood idly by as Germany overran the continent, political schemes and even desertions from the Liberals could easily topple the government and get the Conservatives into power instead. Thus, while it is possible that Britain's entry is delayed, though I personally don't expect by much, it is highly unlikely that Britain finds the luxury to sit out this conflict, as news spreads of German conduct during the invasion of Poland, like the destruction of the city of Kalisk, where they nearly fully destroyed a city of 65,000, both news and propaganda would work to convince Britain of the necessity of entry, while the elites worry about German progress in Russia and the French inability to combat Germany. I would be highly surprised if Britain hadn't joined the war before the end of 1914, and even before this point, they could have already sanctioned Germany and perhaps even launched partial naval blockades. Even if the Liberals truly wanted to wait for a true casus belli to join the war, we could look at shipping towards the Russian Empire through the Baltic and Black Seas. For Russia, these naval routes were crucial in the functioning of their army and logistics, and cutting them off will be a priority for Germany. Aside from disrupting them directly, they might, much like in our timeline, pressure neutral Denmark into closing their waterways, something they were forbidden from doing. If Britain chooses, this could easily be argued as a breach of international law and thus worthy of intervention. Then beyond Britain, the usual suspects also start joining the war. The Ottomans align with the Germans, Italy eventually joins the Entente, and Bulgaria joins the Central Powers. During 1915, we will see the near full collapse of the Balkan Front and further German gains in Eastern Europe. Overall, the balance of power is not all too radically different to our timeline, except Germany is further along in the east and lacks their occupations in the west. The big question now becomes, how long does it take for Russia to collapse? And the answer is, beyond, I don't know, probably longer than you expect. Russia did not collapse because a certain amount of cities were occupied, or because the war just wasn't going well. Fact is, the Russian elites were committed to fighting this war, and whether Germany pushes a bit further a bit earlier does not radically change their perspective. This fact is further emphasized by the fact that even after the abdication of the Tsar, the provisional government continued the war. For Germany to truly defeat Russia, they need to push the Russian people to a breaking point. And for the undereducated and unrepresented people of Russia, this can only come at the hands of years of war, hardship and famine. And Germany performing better militarily does not necessarily make that point arrive faster. The suffering of the people of the home front is not radically increased by the fall of Minsk, and Germany performing so well that they push all the way to the Dnipro in 1915 is over-optimistic. Again, simply due to the fundamental issues for offensive armies during this age. Thus, while we could easily argue that the Tsar might be deposed a few months earlier, I would already be surprised if it's half a year earlier than in our timeline. By that point then, the Germans still first have to deal with a provisional government which attempts to continue the war, which then starts to crumble at the hand of an alternate Bolshevik revolution, which finally allows Germany to mostly conclude the Eastern Front, perhaps somewhere in late 1917. Again, merely a few months earlier than the March 1918 of our timeline. This now returns us to the biggest problem with this German battle plan. What now? Yes, Russia collapsed. Again, perhaps a few months earlier. And we will discuss some potential upsides, but at the end of the day, so what? The Western Front is still completely stuck. The French and the British have solidified their defenses. The entire German army can line up along the border. Punching through directly will never work, and an attempted attack through Belgium will not have the same effect as it did in 1914. And the idea of capitulating France in 1918 is fantasy. Simply put, the only hope for Germany is that the Entente just gets tired and gives up. Which, much like in our timeline, makes this final stretch of the war a slog to see which side gets exhausted first, where we return to the plethora of reasons why the Entente are favored in a war of attrition. German gains are significant, and Ukrainian grain might even alleviate the worst of the German famine. But Ukraine is not some miracle territory with infinite resources. There are issues with production, issues with logistics, issues with rising social unrest, and crucially, if the amount of food necessary for Germany was exported from Ukraine, they would fall into a severe famine themselves, only further destabilizing German control. Beyond just food, especially with the US being Entente aligned, by this point, the Germans start falling behind in nearly every metric. This basically means that the only possible way for Germany to win is for the Entente to just give up, which is basically impossible without further changes. There is no military or economic threat which Germany can use to necessitate this surrender, especially with France being in such a better position than historically. People often describe a negotiated peace deal after Brest-Litovsk as a compromise, but there is no other way to describe this than a German victory, even if Alsace-Lorraine is returned. And without other changes, there is no reason for the West to ever go for it. Then, beyond the fundamentals of a war of attrition, there are still the other negatives of the current German position. Eastern Europe is in anarchy, requiring a garrison to manage, while the escalating civil war in Russia requires constant attention. We see the start of Germany and Austria being rocked by protests and strikes. And while Wilson might join the war a bit later, I don't see why the fundamentals of submarine warfare, the Zimmermann telegraph, or general desires to see the Entente win would have changed for America. The Austro-Hungarian Empire remains unstable, potentially still attempting to negotiate leaving the war, resulting in them falling under closer German oversight. In the Balkan, Greek entry into the war provides opportunity to break the Southern Front into the future. Even more, the Entente need less forces in the West and can thus reinforce such adventures more. Perhaps most importantly though, regardless of anything else Germany has done, the Ottomans are starting to collapse to Britain and Arab rebels. Even if Germany keeps all the other fronts stable, the Ottomans will be the first Central Powers pushed to a definitive breaking point, and once they fall, the southern flank starts looking very feeble. So, while overall the Germans might manage to drag the war out for a couple months longer, at the end of the day, they just have no way to force their way out of the current stalemate and the issues it brings. The only other recourse after the fall of Russia, and it is quite plausible they try this, might indeed be a later attempted Schlieffen plan, akin to the spring offensive of 1918 in our timeline. Once that inevitably fails, Germany is doomed, and through a collapse of their allies and the Southern Front, and a revolution within Germany, the war still likely ends in late 1918 or perhaps early 1919. The question then becomes, in what way could the post-war world be transformed? And the honest answer is, it's difficult to tell, but we will run through a couple of options. The conclusion of the war is only altered by a few months, and the overall image looks similar to our timeline. These few months might still have radically changed Eastern Europe. The Russian Civil War was extremely complicated, and it is very easy to imagine a variety of alternate outcomes just as a result of a slightly earlier peace deal, and Germany entrenching themselves just a bit more in Eastern Europe. Then there is France. I would personally expect that their broad-scale goals remain unchanged, yet we can recognize that France emerges from the war less scarred. It is possible that this also translates to a France which takes a slightly more lenient stance on Germany. Other, smaller butterflies could be Romania and the Ottomans. In the case of Romania, do they ever even join the war in this timeline, or is Russia's situation so bad that they remain neutral until the very end? In the case of the Ottomans, I don't really expect changes, but there is potential for a stronger French attempt to secure their portion of the Treaty of Sèvres. Now, to get it out of the way first, it is far from unthinkable that, in the broad scale, this timeline roughly returns to what we saw in our timeline. Germany might be burdened with a little bit less debt. Perhaps the Soviet Union ends up moderately weaker post-war. But the core of what we recognize from the 30s could remain unchanged. France being just a bit stronger doesn't necessarily mean that they reject appeasement and prevent the rise of Germany early. But of course, since we already know how this plays out, we will focus on a broad look at the timelines which actually diverge from history. Now obviously, the biggest question is whether the Treaty of Versailles is impacted. We can still presume Wilson to be present in these peace talks, but where there might be room for change is in French attitudes towards Germany. Keep in mind, what I'm about to say is far from guaranteed, but there are generally two schools of thought regarding Franco-German relations post-war. The dominant faction called for major expansion of French influence west of the Rhine, to prevent Germany from being able to threaten France in the future. The other school of thought focused on fostering German democracy and seeking a normalization in Franco-German ties. In our timeline, the expansionist camp obviously won out, and this was logical. Twice in 50 years did the Germans invade and lay waste to France. Yet, in this timeline, German efforts remained focused on the east, and there is at least the chance of normalization picking up more steam within France. Now of course, whatever happened, Alsace would need to be returned to France, and France would still seek to curb German militarism. But their positions on things like the Saarland and the occupation of the Rhineland post-war might be moderately loosened. Beyond that, we have the reparations that Germany faced post-war, in our timeline chiefly levied to compensate for damage done to Belgium and France, as well as the destruction of merchant shipping. While they undoubtedly still get settled with some debt, I doubt it's on the same scale. Some reparations for the submarine campaign can still be expected, and perhaps the Entente make Germany pay some compensation to Poland. But at the end of the day, most of the damage has been done to Eastern Europe, who don't have a great power to push to squeeze Germany dry. Territorially, I don't expect the peace to change all too much. Poznan was still undeniably Polish, and an outlet to the sea was still required, and the free city of Danzig was basically the only contender. Other plebiscites would still be held, but I don't see why they would resolve differently. Same with the plebiscite over Schleswig. In terms of the rest of Europe, the broad lines of collapse of Austria-Hungary also hasn't changed. The only exception being if Romania never joined the Entente and France and Britain decided to snub them. But considering Hungary is still a disliked defeated power and quite possibly still has a communist revolution, I highly doubt that even then the borders end up all too radically different. Likewise with the Ottomans, while it's interesting to mention the chance of a slightly different treaty being imposed, at the end of the day France will not commit enough to actually make the Treaty of Sèvres happen, and a Kemalist victory is still likely. As to the Russian Civil War, I believe here we might have the largest possibility for large-scale changes. This war is fragile, essentially pure anarchy, and while seemingly minor, butterfly effects from an earlier victory and longer German domination before their eventual surrender could be absolutely huge. In the most radical changes, a full White Army victory could well be a consequence of the changes we have made. But alternatively, we might see things like the formerly German puppet in Ukraine fight on for longer, or the German Freikorps in the Baltic be more successful, or, quite possibly, the Poles might end up performing better against the Bolsheviks, succeeding in more of their goals. Really, in regard to the Russian Civil War, there are limitless possibilities, and they all depend on how German-Bolshevik relations hold up across this period, as there were even some in Germany which proposed marching to Moscow and St. Petersburg if Lenin didn't comply with German demand, which could even result in a temporary German puppet regime, which would undeniably crack soon after, but would once more shake up the region completely. The exact result is impossible to predict, but I believe that here is the most potential for radical change-ups in the post-war world. But back to something more concrete. If we do indeed assume lessened war reparations and reduce the devastation to the French industrial base, we have therefore removed the need for the French to occupy the Ruhr in 1923, which has the potential for a bunch of knock-on effects on Germany going forwards. While there is definitely still heavy inflation following the war, partially related to the government trying to inflate their way out of wartime debt, the stereotypical hyperinflation of the Weimar era would be avoided. Yet, what we have also avoided is the sympathy which Germany received from nations like the US and UK as a result of the French occupation. Also, the hyperinflation essentially reset the post-war German economy, which long-term might have actually been beneficial for them, while they remained the dominant industrial power of Europe even despite their defeat. The Dawes Plan is also never implemented, thereby removing billions of American dollars being invested into Germany. All in all, it is possible the German economic revival of the 20s is lessened in this timeline, yet their dependence on the American economy is likewise reduced, potentially setting Germany up to better handle a future depression. But finally, we need to discuss general German sentiments towards this alternate peace deal. A large theme I see across alternate histories is that if only Versailles was just slightly less harsh, then the Germans would have all accepted it, Weimar would have never fallen, and Germany and Europe at large would have prospered and lived happily ever after, often with a European coalition against communism, ensuring the whole continent is united in democracy. While this is undeniably a nice view, if taken seriously, I also find it rather dangerous. While undeniably there are now opportunities for a more peaceful world, don't take this as me saying World War II as we saw it was inevitable. Such readings of Versailles ignore Germany itself. However lenient you make Versailles, this will not convince figures like Ludendorff to support Weimar democracy. This does not change the hearts of the men who led the war efforts in World War I. This does not change the minds of many regarding the inferiority and hatred of Poles. This does not remove dreams of Germany's rightful place within Europe. I don't mean to say that these things are inherent to Germany as a nation, completely unpreventable. What I do mean to say is that for the people who hold these beliefs, slightly moderating Versailles is not going to change them. Fundamentally, the German Weimar democracy was always going to be weak, and contrary to popular belief, heavy cracks in the system were already occurring prior to the economic downturn of the 30s. In a similar way, you may be familiar with the stab in the back myth developed in Germany post-war. This was propaganda spread by the German High Command, explaining away their own failures in losing this war by blaming the socialists for starting a revolution and surrendering a winnable war. You may think this could be prevented in this alternate timeline, potentially even with Entente forces present in Alsace before the surrender. Yet, this makes one crucial mistake. This assumes that these figures play fair. That upon French forces setting foot in Alsace, Ludendorff suddenly realizes the error of his ways. As long as Germany loses to a revolution and negotiated surrender, and not because the entire army is unable to fight, the details of the stab in the back myth might change, but it would not be prevented. From the perspective of many of these figures, Versailles went further than just taking this from Germany. It had taken all of this. So, while the stab in the back myth might be less prominent, the overall sentiment of the right wing in Germany would remain broadly unchanged. Germany was unduly humiliated and deserves its spot amongst the European powers. And, most notably, these Germans loathe Poland. Once again, this is not me saying that the NSDAP were inevitable. Far from it. Especially if the effects of the depression are lessened, they absolutely could be. My broader point though is that Weimar democracy was fickle. There were other paths for Germany to go beyond wholesome democracy, ultranationalism, or communism. Germany could easily find itself under a more patient nationalist regime, more reminiscent of the old Kaiserreich, focused on restoring German power, but without seeking to start a world war over it. Their focus instead, first of all, aimed at settling the score with the Poles and fixing the matter of Danzig. It then bears mentioning that there is at least the chance for France to be more decisive in the post-war world, having suffered far less in the previous conflict and coming out of it as a more powerful industrial power. They just might have a larger appetite for confronting a Germany they deem as going too far. While I wouldn't bet on it, appeasement might just be ended earlier by the French, Germany being confronted earlier than they might have hoped. So then, I am sorry for the people who sought a more decisive conclusion to this video. But really, I cannot in good conscience predict those as likely. Rather, the focus of this video lay on hopefully largely debunking the viability of the Russian plan in regards to an overall German victory, as, assuming France doesn't remain neutral, it is a bad gambit for rather crucial reasons. There is no path for victory after the collapse of Russia beyond meekly hoping the West simply gives up and accepts German hegemony over Europe. And considering the balance of power, in this war of attrition, it is unlikely the French people overthrow their government faster than the Germans do theirs. There is reason for cautious optimism about Germany in the post-war world, and we might have removed the horrors of World War II as we knew it in our timeline. Yet, Germany will still be soul-searching for a role in a new world. And while France might be more vigilant regarding German ambitions, through Imperial Japan, whatever regime shapes up in Russia, Mussolini's Italy, and Germany itself, I can hardly expect that the alternate 40s are going to be an altogether peaceful place. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.